Hi, Pastor Anthony here with my first installment of Sermon Snacks about my sermon that was preached entitled Futility on Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 1 through 11. This will be first in a series of presentations as I work through this sermon series. The goal with Sermon Snacks is to kind of give you a little bit of the background, stuff that was kind of left out of the presentation in the sermon, maybe some of the background I worked with, whether it's exegesis or interpretive issues, or just some areas that I couldn't go into in the sermon itself. I've used this analogy of baking a cake, and what I want to present in a sermon is kind of a directed arrow shot of a finished product, cake that is baked with the icing on it, and not give you the eggs, flour, butter, sugar, etc. But here we go. You get to see all of that stuff here in this video. Sermon Snacks number 1. Ecclesiastes 1, 1 through 11, the title was Futility. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that I wasn't able to get into, but are behind the scenes. The first is this word in Hebrew, havel. And it's the word that is translated in the New Revised Standard Version as vanity. You know, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. This is where we get this idea of futility, which is what I use for the title of the sermon. And the word is translated in a variety of ways. It's translated as meaningless in certain translations, as vapor, even as futility. But it's that idea of something like breath, something that dissipates, something that feels futile. And these words, that word occurs 38 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, havel. It occurs 38 times. So it's something that is repeated in the book, and it tells us something about what the book is getting at. This sense of life under the sun, life that doesn't feel purposeful, that feels fleeting, that feels unfulfilled, unsatisfied, that feels in a level meaningless, feels like vanity, feels like futility. Now, in my introduction to Ecclesiastes, I talked about the fact that in the New Testament there are no direct quotations from Ecclesiastes, but that there are allusions. And certainly the clearest one is the one I used in my sermon from Romans 8, 20 and 21, where it talks about creation being subject to futility. And so that word and that allusion is there. Very interesting that that's there, that connection from this Hebrew word, havel. And of course, you remember there is a Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. And so this word from Ecclesiastes is a word that's used in Romans 8:20, the Greek version of that Hebrew word. And also there is another perhaps allusion here in the New Testament, and that is the word vapor. In James 4:14, if you read that, James describes our life being like a vapor. And so this is an important word. It's right there at the beginning of the book, and it will come back again and again, 38 times. This gives us a sense of what was on the teacher's mind, our teacher here of wisdom, Koheleth, and what he was trying to deal with, what he was wrestling with personally. In some ways, the book is a bit of a personal kind of journal of trying to make sense of the world that often feels empty, vain, meaningless, and futile. And I think a lot of us can identify with those struggles. I think they're universal struggles of humanity. Let's talk about a few other words that are important here that were introduced right here in chapter 1 that will be significant throughout the book. And one of them is the word gain. We hear that in verse 3, where it talks about, we toil, and what do we gain from it? And that word is used 9 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, but nowhere else in the Old Testament. So it's idiosyncratic to the book of Ecclesiastes. And it really means what you think it means. It means profit. What is profit? Profit, and this is like net profit. This is what's left over. After paying your expenses, right? You get your revenue, you pay your expenses, your net profit is what's left over, and something you can hold on to. And what the teacher struggles with is there any real substance, any leftovers to our toil and our labors in this world under the sun? And that brings us to the next word, toil. Toil we're introduced to right here in chapter 1, 23 times in the book. This word is used. And there's a whole question about the meaning of toil. I mean, I think most of us would have kind of a negative sense of that, right? Toil sounds like hard labor. And I think that's probably the idea. Some argue it's just pure things that involve human effort, but there's a sense of it being hard labor, right? This kind of onerous sense of that calling, and the question is being asked here. We're working hard, but there doesn't seem to be a lot left over. And is it meaningful at all? What are we doing? Are we on this hamster wheel, this treadmill of life? So toil is a big word we're introduced to here. And then, of course, the phrase under the sun. We're introduced to that right here in the first chapter, in the first 11 verses, under the sun. It occurs 29 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And Sidney Gradanis, who I mentioned, Preaching Christ from Ecclesiastes, the main text that I'm using, referring to as a commentary, he writes, under the sun could be understood well as human life apart from God. Human life apart from God. When you read that phrase, under the sun, it's talking about a worldview of living your life and doing what you're doing, your work, your family, whatever it is, doing that apart from God. And what is that like? So you have this teacher writing about that experience. That's probably the hardest interpretive thing, because you're like, well, does this person not believe in God? Is he questioning God? Well, he's questioning life, and particularly critiquing life lived apart from God. And that's what we see right here in the first chapter. If you live your life apart from God, there's a futility from which you can't escape about the meaning of your life. And that's really the argument that the author is making. Okay, then we go to point number 3. So we've got these big words here. We've got havel, gain, toil, under the sun, vanity, meaning. These will be echoed throughout the book. How about Jesus? I talked about in the end of my sermon about Jesus, and I used that reference to Romans chapter 8, and how Jesus has come to redeem the world from futility, redeem our labors if we're willing to embrace something more than this world under the sun. If we're willing to love God and love our neighbor, there is a pathway out of this life that seems like it's going nowhere, like futility. Now, I would have loved to have more time in my sermon to talk about some of the things Jesus said that parallel this text. Well, here are a couple. I can use this time to do that. Yay! So Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 20. And this passage of Scripture is the parable of the rich fool. And I think it's a perfect commentary that Jesus is making here on Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and what the main point is. This is the parable. Luke chapter 12, verse 16. Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, what should I do? For I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, You fool! This very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. And I think in that parable, you have what Jesus saying a very similar thing here. That life lived simply toiling, accumulating, building bigger barns. What does it all mean? Is there any gain in it? No. As he ends that parable, so it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. This is human life set apart from God, and it ultimately ends up in vanity, meaninglessness. And that's what Jesus is critiquing there. And that's an important and relevant critique for a world in which people seem to be building bigger barns, and that's what life is about. He who dies with the most toys, or she who dies with the most toys wins, kind of thing. And Jesus is speaking against that. The writer of the Ecclesiastes is speaking against that is a way to move your life, to put it on a path towards meaninglessness. Another passage that's relevant from the New Testament is Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21. And this is the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says this, Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust consume and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust consumes, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Familiar words but a very similar idea about gain and profit, about what really produces meaning in our lives, and just kind of a warning to us that of the emptiness that is there when you make your life solely about life under the sun, apart from God, solely about toil and gain for yourself. And then finally, the last passage is Matthew 16:26. Matthew 16:26. And there, Jesus says this, and this is right on point, right? This is very similar to the passage I quoted from 1 Corinthians. For what will it profit them, okay, profit, right, them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? And that's really what the preacher of Ecclesiastes is talking about. There's no gain in life under the sun. The gain, the meaning is found by making your life about something more than yourself, this world, and your labors in it. It's not world demeaning to say that. It's actually world embracing. This is how you make meaning out of this. You have to have something more than life under the sun. So that's some of the things that the passages I would have loved to have shared, but Jesus' commentary on this, but Christ speaks to these very issues. And I'm going to read you a quote from Great Honest, but I forgot the book, so cut here, and I'm back. Okay, so here we are. I wanted a quote from Great Honest on page 48. He summarizes Jesus' message this way. Jesus' message is clear. We gain nothing if we store up treasures on earth. We gain nothing if we toil apart from God. But our lives can have profit if we are, in Jesus' words, rich toward God. If we store up treasures in heaven. If we serve God. Paul confirms Jesus' words. He writes, therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always excelling in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. 1 Corinthians 15:58. This is the text I use in the sermon. And then Great Honest concludes, but if our labor is not in the Lord, if our work is apart from God, human life apart from God, we gain nothing. Nothing left over. We gain nothing. Therefore, Jesus warns us, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Exactly right. And that brings us to the final point, the goal, which I tried to make in the sermon. And this is the goal that Great Honest, this is how he phrases it, the goal of the teacher of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet. He writes, then is to warn Israel, and I would argue to warn us, apart from God, they will not gain anything from all their toil. That is the point. Apart from God, you will not gain anything from your toil. It is futile. And so the call of this is a call to embrace Jesus Christ, to embrace his teaching, and to live your life under the sun, connected to the one who has called us to live for something more than ourselves, more than the profit motive, more than storing things up in our barns, to live, to love him, and to love our neighbor. And if we do that, we can find true meaning in the goodness of this world. That's the message. That's your sermon snacks for this week. I'll talk to you next week. Thanks for listening.